Thank you everybody for coming to hear my presentation. So something about me, I work as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki in folklore studies, and my discipline is folklore studies. And my presentation today focuses on my ongoing postdoctoral research on cultural and social aspects of silence and memory. So my research focuses on the memories and oral histories related to the internment of German and Hungarian citizens in Finland during 1944 to 1946. And my primary research materials consists of oral history interviews of individuals, most of them children of German fathers and Finnish mothers, who were interned as minors and young people. I conducted 26 oral history interviews in Finland and in Germany during 2015 and 2016. And in addition to these interview materials, I have analyzed how the internments have been discussed in media. And methodologically, my research draws from narrative analysis and folklore studies, oral history research, and cultural memory studies. So, my presentation today will focus on the emergence of internment memory after 60 years of silence in Finland. And in my research, I have analyzed how the ex-internees discuss silence and silencing related to the post-internment decades in the context of an oral history interview. I have also analyzed how they represent and deal with the shift from this extended silence to public discussion and acknowledgement of this historical event. And in my presentation, I will concentrate on exploring the interplay of personal and public dimensions of memory construction. And I wish to show that analysis of this interplay is the key to understand the processes that affect which experiences and events of the past become narrated and remembered in society and which do not. But first I will explain the basic historical background of the internments and discuss a little bit about the key methodological concepts of my research. According to a dictionary of human rights, internment usually means, and I quote, detention of those either suspected but not proved to be guilty of crimes or thought to have a high probability of being likely to commit crimes. As such, a policy of internment is in flagrant violation of the core human right of liberty of the person, which almost all constitutional codes protect. Internment, by its very nature, involves a denial of due process and all associated rights, including that to a fair trial, end quote. So basically, internment means detention or imprisonment without a trial. And the background of the internment of German and Hungarian citizens in Finland is the aftermath of the two wars between Finland and the Soviet Union during the Second World War, the Winter War and the Continuation War. And in the latter of these wars, Finland was allied with Nazi Germany. And after the hostilities between Finland and the Soviet Union ended in August of 1944, these countries signed the Armistice Agreement. And the conditions of this agreement were harsh. In addition to loss of territories and extensive reparations to the Allied countries, Finland was obliged to banish German troops from its territory, which led to the Lapland War, and also intern all of the German and Hungarian citizens staying in Finland at that time. And this condition led to the incarceration of almost 500 civilians of German and Hungarian citizenships. And in addition to German and Hungarian men, the Finnish officials also decided to intern their Finnish-born spouses and children, of whom most had lived in Finland all their lives. And due to marriage, these women and their children were technically German or Hungarian nationals, or they had dual citizenships. In addition, the properties of these persons were confiscated and handed over to the Soviet Union as a part of the war reparations. And it is important to note that these interned persons weren't German soldiers. Almost all of these persons who were interned were civilians who did not have any political or military importance, or they did not have any criminal background. Internees were mainly women, children, and elderly persons, and many of them were second or even third generation immigrants. And it is important also to note that the conditions in these Finnish internment camps were quite good. The internees were not mistreated, they were not tortured by guards or any officials, and they were entitled to medical care and they were fed. Although the bad quality of food led to the malnutrition of some of the children. And indeed, many of my interviewees have quite positive memories related to the time of the internment. But the time that came after the internment is typically depicted as more difficult. And majority of these internees were freed in March of 1946. And after that, silence fell over the topic in public and also often on private level for almost 60 years. And during this 60 years of time, the event of internment was totally absent from the public discussion, academic research, and the historical consciousness of Finns in general. And most of these interned people continued their lives in Finland, eventually gaining Finnish citizenships. And next I will explain how the concept of memory is understood in the field of cultural studies. So, memory is generally understood as a set of representations through which the past is symbolically made present. And this means that memory is always constructed from the viewpoint of the present, and it also means that its nature is dynamic, transforming, and creative. And memory is not an archive or storage of information. And this also means that memory cannot be understood only as a cognitive or psychological faculty, but moreover, it is a complex set of creative practices and representations. Furthermore, it's important to note that personal memories and public memory are very much interconnected. And this means that, for example, oral histories, personal experience narratives, and testimonies of individuals both reflect and shape collective or cultural memory. And when memory is understood like this, it is also quite evident that the value of memory is not dependent only on how well it corresponds to the actual facts. Important is also to think which dimensions of the past are remembered and why and how they are remembered. Societal silences have intrigued scholars focusing on social and cultural aspects of memory. And common patterns of explaining social forgetting and silence are the paradigm of hegemonic memory and the paradigm of traumatic memory. And according to this paradigm of hegemonic memory, social forgetting and silence are seen as results of political repression or signs of more discrete cultural hegemony. And conversely, according to the paradigm of traumatic memory, social forgetting is seen as a psychological phenomenon, as a consequence of devastating experiences related to silence or repression. However, researchers of culture have also noted that these two rather mechanical patterns and culture-bounded patterns do not suffice to understand the complexities related to silence in different cultural contexts and different times. And this is also true in the case of the internment in Finland. Indeed, silence related to internment cannot be considered as a result of political repression. intentional suppression of memory or of a fundamental discord between private and public memory. For a long time, the event of internment was too absent from the public consciousness for even to be forcibly or consciously silenced about. And scholars of narrative have approached social silences from different angles. For example, the concept of framing has been seen as one solution to understand the reasons behind societal silencing. Frames are cognitive structures, schemes of interpretation governing the reception and representation of reality and experiences. Frames are part of communication, and without them, experiences or memories cannot be communicated, let alone interpreted. And I suggest that in addition to frame, the concept of tellability, developed in conversational narrative analysis, is relevant in order to analyze and to understand which experiences and events of the past become narrated and remembered and become part of cultural memory. And tellability is a concept that refers to qualities of the story and the storytelling context that make the story worth telling. And tellability requires that the storyteller considers an event to be surprising, important, or newsworthy enough to be reported in a certain communicative context. And as said, after most of these interned persons were freed in March of 1946, silence that occurred in public and often also in private level fell over this topic for almost 60 years. And next I will explain what are the three main reasons that compromised the tellability of the story of internment and thus promoted this kind of silence. And the first reason relates to the unremarkability of the event. During and after wartime, experiences related to crisis were more or less norm in a society. Many of my interviewees explained their silence to me by saying that there was actually nothing to tell, that the overall experience of the post-war life overshadowed the experience of internment. These accounts point to the fact that for a long time the story of internment lacked the criteria of a tellable event, because it did not have any special content or any dramatic features that would have made it worthy, not to mention newsworthy, of telling. Second reason that compromised the tellability was that the story of internment lacked proper kinds of narrative agents, namely, both the right kinds of victims and the right kinds of perpetrators were missing from the story. And this fact very much relates to the cultural ways of understanding detention camps. So in the post-war years, growing interest and knowledge related to Nazi concentration camps on the one hand and to Gulag system in the Soviet Union on the other hand affected the public understanding of the nature of detention camps for civilians and turned it to understand the detention camps as places where innocent civilians are put as a result of more or less deliberate actions of perpetrators with power. And so these fairly undramatic experiences of internment in Finland did not adhere to these frames very well. Thus, the disparity between the internment in Finland and the frame of detention camps compromised the tellability of the experiences related to internment and promoted the silence. And the prevalence of this kind of frame is, however, very much present in my interview materials, even though it did not match with the interviewees' experiences. So, for example, even though I did not explicitly ask my interviewees about the conditions of their internment camps, they often stated to me that they were not tortured or mistreated in any way. And by underlining this, they not only explained their experiences to me, but they also referred to the prevailing frame for understanding detention camps as places where perpetrators torture and torment innocent victims. And based on my analysis, the stigma potential related to the German background is the third factor that compromised the tellability of the story of internment and supported silence. And as we know, in the standard interpretation of the Second World War, Germans were placed on a guilty side, which also affected the general attitudes towards Germans. It can be said that ex-internees in Finland were also vulnerable to stigmatization, but they could pass as long as their stigma, meaning their German background, was not recognized or revealed. And several of my interviewees reflected how they did not want to speak about the internment because it would have possibly raised the questions about their German backgrounds. And German background was something that they did not want to highlight. And for example, one woman who was born in 1926 explained to me, and I quote one of my interview tape. But after that liberation, life was completely different, totally different. So that I felt myself very lonely because others of the same age, the schoolmates, it was as if it did not exist anymore. Like you had to change yourself into an entirely different person to leave that. Then also, even my father told us, do not speak German on the streets. So that I had kind of feelings of guilt that this Germanness is something bad. End quote. Next, I will discuss the rupturing of this kind of silence and the emergence of the public awareness related to internments. In 2003, the Finnish public service broadcasting company Yle broadcast a documentary film by the journalist Mikko Määttälä entitled Finland of Prison Camps, vankileirien Suomi. Before this documentary film, the event of internment had been totally absent from public discussion. And the documentary film also included information that came as a surprise and a shock for the ex-internees. The film revealed that the incarceration of Finnish-born women and children was based on the decision of Finnish officials and not of the Soviet Union. And until then, the ex-internees had believed that their internment was ordered by the Soviet Union, but now they learned that their own country was responsible. So this documentary film set in motion a process of public awareness about internment, which included a state-funded research project that focused on the official archived documents related to this event, a published popular history book, media discussions, and organization of ex-internees. Eventually, this process led to the enactment of the Law of Compensation on September 1st, 2014. And according to this law, those interned persons who were under 18 years of age, Finnish citizens or adult children of Finnish citizens, were entitled to compensation of 3,000 euros. And this revelation of the documentary related to the role of Finnish officials in deciding to intern these people is the most important reason also why the silence surrounding this topic was eventually broken on personal level. And I argue that this new information actually managed to end the silence and begin the process of construction of memory of the internment because it addressed all of the major reasons behind the silence which I discussed before. First, the new information questioned the unremarkability and relative normality of the internment by shedding light on the shady reasons behind the Finnish officials' decision to intern women and children. The reasons for internment is still unknown, but probably it was done as a measure of precaution. The information proved that even by wartime standards, the internment of children and Finnish-born women was unjustified. And this information also taught the ex-internees to think of their internment and their past in a new way, not as one of the many unpleasant but justifiable events of wartime, but as pure injustice. Second, the new information that the documentary provided enabled to bring the narrative of the internment closer to the existing frames of understanding war experiences, which relate to the oppositional positions between victims and perpetrators. And this new information was presented in the media, for example in newspaper articles, as hidden information that was now exposed. And even though the information was hardly kept in secret deliberately, telling about it after 60 years of silence supported the interpretation of the internment as a more or less deliberate injustice. This added an element of exposure and surprise to the story of internment. And this newly emerging interpretation also imposed the role of perpetrators on Finnish officials, while the journalistic articles included testimonies and comments of the ex-internees. The new information, in a way, validated the testimonies of ex-internees as they gained the positions of victims. Third, by pointing out that even though internees were indeed German nationals, they were first and foremost innocent victims who were treated unjustly by the Finnish officials. The documentary film managed also to mitigate the stigma potential related to German background that earlier had promoted the untellability of ex-internees' internment experiences. So the internees no longer needed to fear of misinterpretations that the previous lack of general knowledge of the event had generated. In other words, the story of internment became more tellable. So, to conclude, my analysis shows that the documentary film indeed had a significant role in making the story of internment tellable by creating a frame for telling the story. And this frame includes surprise, collapse of beliefs, and newly defined agents of the story. In addition, the documentary film and the new information became a central part of the personal stories of internment. And in more general level, I see that the notion of the interplay of personal and public dimensions of construction of cultural memory is the key to understand the processes that affect which experiences and events of the past become narrated and remembered and which do not. And I also see that these notions are crucial in order to understand the processes of cultural memory and processes that define which events of the past are important in present. It's a key to understand that process also in general. So, thank you very much.